The first-class cabin of Atlantic Crest Airways Flight 918 shimmered with quiet luxury, where soft leather seats and crystal glasses reflected an air of exclusivity. Standing in the aisle, Naomi Okafor Sinclair held her designer carry-on in one hand and her boarding pass in the other. Dressed in a simple linen dress with minimal makeup, she didn't fit the polished aesthetic of the other first-class passengers, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by the flight attendants. Their eyes trailed over her with thinly veiled suspicion. "Excuse me," said Christine Barrett, the head flight attendant, her platinum blonde hair pulled so tightly into a bun that it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent look of disdain. "I believe you're in the wrong section. Economy boarding doesn't start for another 20 minutes. Naomi offered a polite, practiced smile that gave nothing away. "I'm in the correct section, seat 2A, she said, extending her boarding pass. Christine took it with obvious skepticism, glancing at it as if expecting to find an error. "And how exactly did you come by a first-class ticket?" The question lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Several nearby passengers looked up from their pre-flight cocktails, their curiosity piqued. "I purchased it," Naomi replied evenly. Though her Nigerian accent had faded after 15 years in the United States, a hint of it remained in the crispness of her words. "Like everyone else." "Of course," Christine said, though her tone suggested she believed anything but. "It's just that we've had misunderstandings before." She exchanged a look with another flight attendant, a tall man with 2 white teeth and an air of forced concern. His name tag read Derek Sullivan. "Is there an issue here?" Derek asked, his voice oozing faux professionalism. "I'm sorry, what was your name again?" Christine asked, though Naomi had yet to offer it. "Dr. Okafor," Naomi corrected, feeling her patience thin. "And no, there shouldn't be an issue. I'd simply like to take my seat." Derek's eyes narrowed slightly. "Doctor, is it? And what kind of doctor would that be?" "I have a PhD in international economics," Naomi answered. "Now, if you don't mind." "Oh, a PhD," Christine cut in, her laugh sharp, like glass breaking. "For a moment we thought, well, never mind." Naomi knew exactly what they thought. But she also knew that making a scene would only confirm whatever prejudiced notions they already held. "My seat," she prompted again. Derek gave her a tight smile, falsely apologetic. "I'm afraid there's been a computer error. Our system shows that your seat is already occupied by another passenger." Naomi felt a familiar sinking sensation. She had heard of this tactic before. "That's strange," she said calmly. "I checked in online 3 hours ago and selected this seat myself." Christine shrugged, her smile never wavering. "Computers, you know, so unreliable, especially with certain demographic inputs." Naomi felt the sting of the veiled insult but refused to let it show. "I see, and where exactly do you propose I sit?" Derek made a show of checking his tablet. "We can find you something in economy, I'm sure, perhaps near the lavatory. Many of your colleagues seem to prefer that area." Naomi stiffened, her composure faltering for the first time. "My colleagues?" "You know," Christine leaned in, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "The other nannies." And there it was, the assumption that had tainted every interaction since she stepped on board. In their eyes, Naomi wasn't a first-class passenger, she was help. A servant who had mistakenly wandered into a space reserved for her employers. "I am not a nanny," Naomi said, her voice steady despite the slow burn of humiliation creeping up her spine. "And I would appreciate it if you directed me to my assigned seat, for which I paid a considerable sum." Derek and Christine exchanged another glance, this one tinged with irritation at her unwillingness to back down. "Listen," Derek said, dropping the thin veneer of customer service. "We all know who's supposed to be sitting where. There's a perfectly good seat in economy, or you can wait for the next flight. Your choice." Naomi opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a deep voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem with my wife's seating arrangement?" The voice belonged to Jonathan Sinclair, CEO of Atlantic Crest Airways, who had just stepped onto the plane. At 6.2, with sharp blue eyes and an air of effortless authority, his presence was impossible to ignore. His tailored suit and confident stance marked him as a man accustomed to control. At 52, he was more distinguished than traditionally handsome, but the weight of his influence was undeniable. The transformation in the flight attendants was immediate. Christine's face lost all color, and Derek's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, like a fish gasping for air. "Mr. Sinclair," Christine finally managed, her voice unnaturally high. "We weren't expecting you on this flight." "Evidently not," Jonathan replied coolly, moving to stand beside Naomi. "Otherwise, I imagine you might have treated my wife with the respect she deserves." "Your wife?" Derek echoed, his shock evident as his gaze darted between them. "Yes, Derek," Jonathan confirmed, using the flight attendant's name deliberately, making it clear he had been listening longer than they realized. "Dr. Naomi Okafor Sinclair, Harvard Ph.D., published economist, and member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Also, as it happens, the love of my life and your boss's wife." The silence that followed was deafening. Around them, other first-class passengers were openly staring, some with embarrassment, others with barely concealed fascination. "Sir, there's been a terrible misunderstanding," Christine stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. "We were simply trying to resolve a seating issue." "A seating issue that didn't exist until you created one," Jonathan cut in sharply. "I heard enough to understand exactly what was happening here." "Mr. Sinclair, please," Derek tried again, his professional smile now a desperate grimace. "We would never intentionally—" "Save it," Jonathan interrupted, raising a hand to silence him. "We'll discuss this later, at length, but for now, I'd like my wife to be shown to her seat, her correct seat, with the apology and courtesy she deserves." Naomi, who had been watching this unfold with a complicated mix of vindication and embarrassment, finally spoke. "It's all right, John," she said, her voice measured. "I can find my own seat." She turned to the flight attendants, her dignity intact despite their best efforts to strip it from her. "It's 2A, as I mentioned earlier." Christine, now visibly trembling, gestured toward the window seat in the second row. "Of course, Dr. Okafor Sinclair, right this way? May I take your bag?" "No, thank you," Naomi said coolly. "I believe I've had enough of your assistance for one day." As she moved past them, head held high, Jonathan remained in the aisle, his gaze fixed on the two flight attendants, who were now studying their shoes with great interest. "You'll both report to my office immediately upon landing," he said quietly. "And I suggest you spend this flight contemplating whether you still wish to be employed by this airline when we reach our destination." With that, he joined Naomi in the adjacent seat, taking her hand in his own and kissing it gently, a silent but unmistakable show of solidarity. As the plane prepared for takeoff, a heavy silence settled over the first-class cabin. For Christine and Derek, it was the cold realization that their casual prejudice had not only been exposed but might cost them their careers. For the other passengers, it was the discomfort of witnessing the ugly truth that often lurked beneath polished privilege. And for Naomi and Jonathan, it was a familiar pain, one they had faced before and would undoubtedly face again. But at least for today, justice had been swift and undeniable. As the aircraft hummed with the final boarding procedures, the first-class cabin, moments ago filled with subtle murmurs and judgmental stares, had turned deathly silent. The tension that had crackled between Christine Barrett and Derek Sullivan now thickened into something else entirely. Panic. Standing near the entrance of the cabin, Jonathan Sinclair, CEO of Atlantic Crest Airways, exuded effortless authority. His 6'2" frame, broad shoulders, and perfectly tailored navy suit demanded attention. His salt-and-pepper hair, neatly combed back, framed piercing blue eyes that scanned the scene with razor-sharp precision. He was a man accustomed to command, and at this moment, the flight crew realized with dawning horror that he had witnessed their conduct. Christine's face drained of all color, and Derek's professional smile twitched, faltering as his mind scrambled for an escape. "Mr. Sinclair?" Christine finally managed, her voice unnaturally high. We weren't expecting you on this flight." "Clearly," Jonathan replied, his voice cool and measured as he moved beside Naomi Okafor Sinclair. His presence next to her sent a clear, unspoken message. "Otherwise, I suspect my wife would have received the treatment she is entitled to." Derek blinked, his shock poorly concealed. "Your wife?" "Yes," Jonathan confirmed without hesitation. He made no attempt to soften the impact of his words, allowing them to settle heavily over the flight attendants and the eavesdropping passengers alike. "Dr. Naomi Okafor Sinclair, Harvard PhD, published economist, senior advisor to the Global Economic Development Council. Also, as it happens, the love of my life, and your employer's wife. A ripple of awareness passed through the cabin. The weight of their mistake crashed down on Christine and Derek with a force neither had been prepared for. Christine opened her mouth, desperate to salvage what remained of her professionalism. Sir, I assure you there's been a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that didn't exist until you created it, Jonathan cut in, his tone as sharp as a blade. I heard enough to know exactly what happened. Mr. Sinclair, we would never intentionally, Derek began, his carefully rehearsed charm returning in a last-ditch effort to mend the situation. Save it, Jonathan said, raising a hand to silence him. We will discuss this later. At length. The emphasis on the last word made Christine visibly flinch. For now, he continued, I expect my wife to be escorted to her correct seat with the level of courtesy that should have been extended to her from the start. Naomi, who had been standing in quiet but firm dignity, finally spoke. It's all right, John, she said, her voice steady. I can find my own seat. She turned to the flight attendants, her chin slightly lifted, meeting their gazes head-on. It's 2A, as I mentioned earlier. Christine, her hands trembling slightly, gestured stiffly toward the window seat. Of course, Dr. Okafor Sinclair, right this way. May I assist you with your bag? No, thank you, Naomi replied smoothly. I believe I've had enough of your assistance for one day. As she walked past them, head held high, Jonathan remained in the aisle, his gaze locked onto the two flight attendants. Christine and Derek, who moments ago had exuded such unwarranted confidence, were now studying their shoes with great interest. You will both report to my office immediately upon landing, Jonathan said quietly, his voice laced with finality. And I suggest you spend the remainder of this flight seriously considering whether you still wish to be employed by this airline when we reach our destination. With that, he turned and took his seat beside Naomi. His hand found hers, fingers curling around hers gently, and he lifted it to his lips in a quiet, meaningful gesture. It spoke of more than affection. It was a declaration, a reminder that they had faced this before and would face it again, but never alone. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, the weight of what had transpired settled heavily over the first-class cabin. For Christine and Derek, it was the sickening realization that their prejudice had not only been exposed, but might cost them everything. For the other passengers, it was the discomfort of witnessing the unspoken rules of privilege and bias laid bare. And for Naomi and Jonathan, it was another painful but familiar moment in a lifetime of proving they belonged in spaces where others believed they did not. But what no one in that cabin could have predicted was that this moment, this seemingly isolated act of discrimination, was only the beginning. A chain reaction had been set in motion. A storm was coming, one that would not only test Naomi and Jonathan's marriage but shake the very foundation of Atlantic Crest Airways. And no one, not even Jonathan himself, was prepared for what was about to unfold. Inside the executive offices of Atlantic Crest Airways, Jonathan Sinclair sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he regarded Christine Barrett and Derek Sullivan. They stood before him like schoolchildren summoned to the principal's office, shifting uneasily under his unreadable gaze. Tell me, Jonathan said, his voice deceptively calm. Do you know why this airline launched its diversity and inclusion initiative 3 years ago? Neither flight attendant seemed eager to answer. After a beat of silence, Christine cleared her throat. To increase representation within the company? Jonathan inclined his head slightly. That was part of it. His expression hardened. But the real reason? Because I've watched my wife get mistaken for the help one too many times. In hotels, in restaurants, and now, in my own airline. He leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes locking onto theirs. So imagine my surprise when, after millions spent on training, consultants, and policy changes, I board one of my planes and find my own staff engaging in exactly the behavior we've worked to eliminate. Sir, we deeply regret. Derek began, his usual smooth confidence absent. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Jonathan cut in sharply. Let's be absolutely clear about that. It was prejudice, plain and simple. Christine's eyes glistened, though Jonathan suspected the moisture had more to do with fear for her job than genuine remorse. Mr. Sinclair, I have friends of all backgrounds. I would never. Spare me the sum of my best friend's defense, Jonathan interrupted, his patience visibly thinning. Your actions speak louder than your excuses. Derek swallowed hard, cutting straight to the point. What happens now? Jonathan studied them both for a long moment before answering. That depends on whether you're capable of learning from this, and on something else entirely. Christine's voice wavered. What? My wife, Jonathan said simply. Unlike me, Naomi believes in second chances. She thinks firing you outright wouldn't solve the problem. It would just push it somewhere else. Against my better judgment, I'm offering you a choice. Relief flickered across their faces, though it was tinged with wariness. You can take a standard severance package and leave the company today, Jonathan continued, or you can accept a temporary demotion and transfer to our new inclusion and equity program. Derek hesitated. What exactly would that entail? 6 months working directly with our diversity team. You'll visit our hubs, work with employees from every level of the company, and assist in implementing new anti-bias protocols. Jonathan's smile was cold. You'll be the living example of why those protocols exist. Christine and Derek exchanged glances, both clearly weighing their options. Finally, Christine forced a bright, eager tone into her voice. We'll take the second option. We want to be part of the solution. I thought you might, Jonathan murmured, unconvinced by their sudden change of heart. He pressed a button on his desk. Miss Patel from HR will provide you with the details. You're dismissed. The 2 flight attendants hurried out of the office, leaving Jonathan alone in the silence. He turned his chair toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. He should have felt satisfaction at how he had handled the situation, but instead a nagging sense of unease settled in his chest. This wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just about Christine and Derek. This was systemic, embedded deep within the company he had built. And worse, it had happened to Naomi. His phone buzzed. A message from Naomi flashed across the screen. Dinner tonight. I invited Camila and David. Jonathan frowned slightly. Camila Vega, Naomi's best friend and fiercest defender, was a civil rights attorney with a razor-sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. David, her husband, was a professor of literature, quieter but equally perceptive. Tonight would not be the peaceful, reflective evening Jonathan had hoped for. Looking forward to it, he texted back. A small lie, justified by his desire not to add to Naomi's burdens. Across town. In their spacious Brooklyn Heights townhouse, Naomi Okafor Sinclair ended a call with her publisher. Her upcoming book on global economic inequality was generating significant pre-release buzz, and the publicity demands were mounting. But even as she confirmed a podcast interview and an op-ed submission, her mind wasn't fully on her career. She set her phone down and moved to the window, watching the golden glow of the evening sun reflecting off the East River. The incident on the plane had affected her more than she had admitted to Jonathan. It wasn't just the humiliation. It wasn't even the anger. It was the exhaustion, the never-ending burden of proving she belonged. No matter how many degrees she earned, how many rooms she walked into as an equal, there would always be someone who assumed she didn't deserve her place. A soft chime signaled the elevator arriving in their home. Camila Vega stepped inside, radiating the confident energy that made her one of the most formidable attorneys in New York. She dropped her designer briefcase on the kitchen island and folded her arms. Tell me you fired those racist flight attendants. Naomi exhaled, a tired smile playing on her lips. Hello to you too, Camila. I'm serious, Camila continued, grabbing a sparkling water from the fridge. Please tell me they're updating their resumes as we speak. They're not being fired, Naomi admitted, joining her at the island. Jonathan assigned them to the company's inclusion program instead. Camila nearly choked on her drink. You're kidding. You're making the people who profiled you responsible for teaching others about bias? That's like putting an arsonist in charge of fire safety training. Naomi shrugged. Firing them wouldn't fix the problem. This way, they might actually learn something. Or they might just get better at hiding their prejudices, Camila countered. You're too forgiving, Naomi. Always have been. And you're too quick to assume people can't change, Naomi replied, without heat. They had been having variations of this argument for the past 15 years. Camila shook her head, but before she could respond, the elevator chimed again. Her husband, David Vega, entered, carrying a bottle of wine. His slightly rumpled appearance suggested a long day at the university. "Sorry I'm late," he said, pressing a kiss to Naomi's cheek. "Faculty meeting ran over. Then, there was an accident on the FDR." He looked between the two women, immediately sensing the tension. "Did I interrupt something?" "Just Camila being Camila," Naomi said lightly, taking the wine from him. "Meaning I was pointing out the obvious while Naomi made excuses for the status quo," Camila clarified, though she softened the jab with a small smile. David, used to his wife's directness, simply nodded. "Ah, so the usual then," he glanced around. "Jonathan's not home yet?" "He texted. He's on his way," Naomi replied, grateful for the shift in conversation. "Shall we open this while we wait?" As she busied herself pouring the wine, her mind drifted elsewhere. The incident on the plane had been a moment of reckoning. Not just for Atlantic Crest Airways, but for her marriage. Because while Jonathan had stood beside her today, would he always? Or, when forced to choose between protecting his company or protecting her, would he hesitate? She wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer, and she had a feeling that soon, very soon, she would have to find out. As the evening deepened, the air in the Brooklyn Heights townhouse grew thick with unspoken tensions. Naomi Okafor Sinclair stood by the kitchen island, absently swirling the deep red wine in her glass, but her mind was elsewhere. The IMF offer lingered in the back of her thoughts, pressing against her like an unanswered question. 6 weeks. Geneva. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She hadn't told Jonathan yet, and she knew exactly why. The chime of the elevator signaled his arrival before she could dwell on it further. Jonathan Sinclair stepped into the apartment, his tie loosened, exhaustion clear in the way he carried himself, but when he spotted their guests, he managed a warm smile. "Camila?" "David." He nodded in greeting as he set his briefcase down. "Always a pleasure, even when I suspect Camila is about to tell me everything I've done wrong this week." Camila Vega smirked, leaning against the counter. "Only because someone has to. You're surrounded by too many yes men all day." Jonathan chuckled, unbothered. "Not all men," he corrected smoothly, turning to Naomi and pressing a kiss to her cheek. "My new head of operations is a woman, as you well know." Camila's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ah yes, Isla Nguyen, the token female executive who makes all your diversity statistics look better on paper." David Vega, accustomed to his wife's sharp edges, gave Jonathan a look of sympathy. "Maybe we could ease into the confrontational part of the evening," he suggested. "At least let me have a sip of wine first." Naomi exhaled, grateful for the shift in tone. "Agreed. Let's open another bottle while we still like each other." As they settled in, the conversation turned lighter. David's latest research project, an upcoming gala, the latest absurdities of New York real estate. But Naomi could feel Jonathan's gaze on her. He knew she was holding something back, and he wasn't wrong. Camila, however, was never one to let things lie. "So Naomi," she said, swirling her drink, "have you told Jonathan about Geneva yet?" Jonathan's head snapped up. "Geneva?" The room went still. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. She shot Camila a look, but her friend only lifted a brow as if to say, "You were going to have to tell him eventually." Jonathan set his glass down. "What's in Geneva?" Naomi hesitated, then met his gaze. "The IMF offered me a position, leading a new economic development initiative in sub-Saharan Africa." Jonathan blinked once, twice. "And when exactly did this offer come in?" 2 weeks ago." Silence. Camila, never one to shy away from tension, sipped her wine like she was watching a courtroom drama unfold. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "And when were you planning on telling me? Or was I supposed to find out when you were packing your bags?" "That's not fair," Naomi said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I was waiting for the right moment." Which apparently required Camila's presence as backup. Jonathan noted, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. "For the record, I've been telling her to talk to you since the offer came in," Camila interjected. David cleared his throat. "Maybe we should give you two some privacy to discuss this." "No need," Jonathan said, standing abruptly. "I have some calls to make anyway. Asia doesn't sleep just because it's dinner time in New York." Naomi watched as he disappeared into his office, tension radiating from every step. "Well," Camila said after a moment, That went about as well as I expected. Naomi shot her a look. You didn't help. The truth was going to come out eventually, Camila defended, and maybe now you two can have an actual conversation about your future instead of dancing around it. David, ever the peacemaker, began gathering the dessert plates. Whatever happens next, I think we've outstayed our welcome. After they left, Naomi stood outside Jonathan's office door, gathering her thoughts. She knocked gently before stepping inside. Jonathan was at his desk, his laptop open, but he wasn't working, just staring at the screen. I need some time, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I just found out my wife has been planning a major life change without me. That's not something I can process in 5 minutes. Naomi swallowed. I wasn't planning anything, I was considering an opportunity. Jonathan finally looked up at her. Then why didn't you tell me? She hesitated. Because I was afraid of this reaction, that you'd see it as me leaving you, rather than pursuing something for myself. His expression softened. Is that what you think of me? That I don't want you to succeed? No, she said quickly. I know you want me to succeed, but on terms that don't disrupt your life. She paused. When was the last time we made a major decision based on my career rather than yours? The question landed between them like a weight. Jonathan's fingers drummed lightly against the desk. That's not entirely fair, he said, though he sounded more tired than defensive. When you joined the President's Council, I rearranged my entire schedule to accommodate your trips to D.C. And I appreciated that, Naomi acknowledged. But that was a part-time advisory role. It didn't require uprooting our lives. This is different. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he asked, What exactly would you be doing in Geneva? Naomi felt something inside her loosen just a bit. He wasn't dismissing it, he was asking. She took a seat across from him. I'd be heading a new initiative on economic development in Africa, working directly with finance ministers to implement sustainable policies, helping shape the future of global economic strategy. Jonathan ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. That does sound like the perfect job for you. Naomi studied him. Then why do I feel like you're waiting for me to say I won't take it? Jonathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his chair toward the window, gazing out at the skyline. Then he asked the question that would define their future. And what does this mean for us? Naomi's throat tightened. That depends, she said softly, on whether we can find a way for both of our dreams to exist, instead of just one always taking precedence. Jonathan met her gaze, and for the first time, Naomi saw it clearly. The crossroads they had reached. Not just about Geneva, but about everything. The conversation wasn't over. It was just beginning. The evening had started with carefully measured politeness, but by the time the dishes were cleared and wineglasses refilled, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally reached a boiling point. Seated across from Naomi Okafor Sinclair, Jonathan had been watching her closely all night. He had noticed the way she deflected Camila's pointed questions about her future, just as she had noticed the way his jaw tightened when he casually mentioned his upcoming trip to Tokyo for the airline's expansion. But it wasn't until dessert that the carefully constructed civility of the evening cracked wide open. Camila, never one to hold back a provocation, raised her glass in a mock toast. To Atlantic Crest Airways, she said, her voice laced with sarcasm, where first-class service comes with a side of racial profiling. David shot her a warning glance, but she ignored it. I'm just saying what we're all thinking, Camila continued, her lawyer instincts fully engaged. What happened to Naomi wasn't an isolated incident. It's a systemic issue. And yet, somehow, people like Jonathan still think they can fix institutional bias with a few well-publicized initiatives and a black wife. The room went still. Jonathan's face remained unreadable as he set down his fork. Are you suggesting that my marriage to Naomi is some kind of PR strategy? I'm suggesting, Camila replied evenly, that proximity to blackness doesn't automatically mean you understand the black experience. And maybe your company's diversity issues run deeper than 2 flight attendants with poor judgment. David, looking like he wanted to slide under the table, cleared his throat. Camila, Naomi, torn between exhaustion and frustration, studied Jonathan's reaction. This was a conversation they had skirted around for years, the gap between their experiences. And now, thanks to Camila, it was out in the open. To her surprise, Jonathan nodded slowly. You may be right, he admitted, setting his napkin aside. The incident on the plane made me realize we've been treating diversity as a checkbox, rather than a fundamental shift in culture. He turned his attention to Naomi. That's why I want you to take over the company's inclusion initiative. Naomi blinked. What? You've been saying for years that our approach is too performative, Jonathan continued. Now's your chance to reshape it. Full autonomy. Direct access to me. Whatever resources you need. The offer hung in the air, heavy with implications. Naomi felt 3 pairs of eyes on her, waiting for her response. That's unexpected, she said finally, choosing her words carefully. But I'm not sure it's the right move. For several reasons. Jonathan's brow furrowed. Like what? She took a steadying breath. For one, people will assume I got the position because I'm your wife. For another, it would mean putting my own career on hold. And finally. She hesitated, then decided there was no point in delaying it any longer. I've been offered a position with the IMF in Geneva. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jonathan's face shifted. Shock first, then hurt, and finally, something colder. Naomi recognized the expression immediately. It was the same controlled, unreadable look he used in the boardroom when he didn't want anyone to see what he was really thinking. I see, he said at last. His voice was too neutral. And how long have you known about this offer? Naomi exhaled. 2 weeks. Jonathan's fingers drummed lightly against the table. 2 weeks, he repeated flatly. And when exactly were you planning to tell me? Or was I supposed to find out when you were packing your bags for Switzerland? That's not fair, Naomi shot back. I was waiting for the right moment. Jonathan let out a quiet, humorless laugh, which apparently required Camila's presence as backup. Camila, sensing that her role in the conversation had shifted from instigator to witness, raised her hands in mock surrender. For the record, she said, I've been telling her to talk to you about this since the offer came in. David, ever the peacemaker, cleared his throat. Maybe we should give you two some privacy. Jonathan exhaled sharply and stood from the table. No need, he said, his voice clipped. I have calls to make. Tokyo doesn't wait. He left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The second he was gone, Camila turned to Naomi. That, she said, was a disaster. Naomi closed her eyes, pressing her fingers against her temple. You don't say. The silence in the Brooklyn Heights townhouse was thick long after Camila and David had left. Naomi stood in the dimly lit hallway, her hand resting on the doorframe of Jonathan's office. From inside, she could hear the faint murmur of his voice. He was on a call, but she doubted it was urgent. More than likely, it was an excuse. An escape. She knocked lightly before pushing the door open. Jonathan sat at his desk, phone pressed to his ear, his expression unreadable. When he saw her, he ended the call without hesitation. I need some time, Naomi, he said quietly, his voice heavy. I just found out my wife has been planning a major life change without me. That's not something I can process in 5 minutes. Naomi stepped inside, arms crossed. I wasn't planning anything, Jonathan. I was considering an offer. That's not the same thing. Jonathan exhaled, rubbing his temples. A semantic difference, maybe. He looked up at her, his gaze sharp but tired. The point is, you kept it from me. Why? The question was fair. Naomi took a breath, choosing her words carefully. Because I was afraid of this reaction, she admitted. That you'd see it as a rejection of everything we've built, rather than an opportunity for me to grow. Jonathan's shoulders relaxed slightly, but the tension didn't fully leave his expression. Is that really what you think of me? His voice was quieter now. That I don't want you to succeed? No, Naomi said immediately. I know you want me to succeed, but on terms that don't disrupt your life too much. She hesitated before continuing. When was the last time we made a major decision based on my career, rather than yours? The weight of the question hung between them. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, considering her words. That's not entirely fair, he said at last, though his tone lacked conviction. When you joined the Global Economic Council, I rearranged my schedule to accommodate your work in Washington. And I appreciated that, Naomi acknowledged. But that was a part-time role. It didn't require uprooting our lives. This is different. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. His fingers tapped lightly against the edge of his desk. Tell me about the position, he said finally. What exactly would you be doing at the IMF? The shift in his tone, a willingness to listen rather than argue, felt like an opening. Naomi moved closer, lowering herself into the chair across from him. I'd be leading a new initiative on economic development in Africa, she explained, unable to keep the passion from her voice. Working directly with finance ministers to implement sustainable policies, making sure past mistakes aren't repeated. Jonathan exhaled, rubbing his jaw. That does sound perfect for you. A flicker of pride crossed his face, muted, but there. It combines everything you've worked toward. Your expertise, your connection to the region. Naomi nodded, encouraged. Exactly. This is the kind of opportunity I've been building toward my entire career. Jonathan nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Then, after a moment, he asked the real question. And what does this mean for us? Naomi's breath caught. That was the question that had kept her awake at night, the one she hadn't yet answered for herself. That depends, she said honestly, searching his face. On whether we can find a way for both of our dreams to exist together, instead of one always taking precedence. Their eyes met, and in that moment, they both understood. This wasn't just about Geneva, it was about their entire marriage, and whatever happened next, everything was about to change. The morning after their tense dinner, Naomi Okafor Sinclair woke to find Jonathan's side of the bed empty. A note on his pillow. Went in early. Urgent situation at the office. The words were brief, clinical. A reflection of the widening space between them. Naomi sighed, running a hand over her short curls, before forcing herself out of bed. She had an 11 a.m. meeting with her publisher, followed by lunch with the IMF representative who had extended the Geneva offer. The timing felt almost poetic, like the universe was forcing her to make a decision she had been avoiding. Halfway through her morning coffee, her phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications. She ignored them at first, assuming Camila was checking in after last night's disaster. But when she finally glanced at the screen, her stomach lurched. Breaking news. Atlantic Crest CEO's wife allegedly racially profiled by company staff. Naomi's hands tightened around her mug. What the hell? She muttered, quickly opening the article. According to the report, an anonymous source had leaked damning details about the incident on her flight. Some of the alleged quotes from the flight attendants were even worse than what had actually been said. The entire piece centered around the irony of an airline that publicly championed diversity failing to protect its own CEO's wife from discrimination. Her phone rang. Jonathan. She took a deep breath before answering. I assume you've seen the news, he said, skipping any pleasantries. His voice was sharp, controlled fury barely contained. Just now, Naomi confirmed. Jonathan, I swear, I didn't say anything to the press. I know you didn't, he replied immediately, but someone did, and that someone had inside knowledge of what happened on that plane. The unspoken implication hung between them. Only a handful of people had known the full details. Jonathan, Naomi, the two flight attendants, and Camila. Naomi swallowed hard. You think it was Camila? Jonathan's exhale crackled through the phone. She's a civil rights attorney with media connections and a history of forcing corporate accountability through public pressure. And after last night, it's not hard to believe she'd take matters into her own hands. That doesn't mean she leaked the story, Naomi argued, though doubt gnawed at the edges of her conviction. Camila's passion often led her to make choices Naomi wouldn't. Choices that, while righteous, sometimes bordered on reckless. Regardless of who leaked it, Jonathan continued, we have a PR crisis on our hands. His voice was clipped, all business now. The board is calling an emergency meeting this afternoon. I need you there. Naomi hesitated. I have meetings today, she said carefully, ones that would be difficult to reschedule. A beat of silence. Then, Jonathan's voice, cool but edged with frustration. More difficult than saving your husband's company from a full-blown racism scandal? The words stung, not just because of his tone, but because of the truth buried in them. This was exactly what they had argued about the night before. The unspoken expectation that, when push came to shove, his priorities would outrank hers. Naomi exhaled slowly. I'll see what I can do. Her tone was deliberately non-committal. Naomi, please. Jonathan's voice softened, the frustration giving way to something closer to genuine need. I'm not asking as your husband right now, he said. I'm asking as someone who needs your expertise. You understand these issues better than anyone else at the table. If we're going to navigate this correctly, I need your voice in that room. It was the right approach, appealing to her intellect rather than her marital obligations. And they both knew it. Even as she recognized the manipulation in his words, Naomi couldn't deny the truth in them. I'll move some things around, she said finally. But even as she said it, she wondered, was she making a choice, or just delaying the inevitable? Naomi checked her watch. 1:45 p.m. The Atlantic Crest Airways board meeting was in 15 minutes. She had spent her morning rescheduling meetings, dodging reporters, and trying to untangle her own conflicted feelings about being here at all. Was she helping solve a real problem? Or was she, once again, making Jonathan's crisis her priority at the expense of her own? She didn't have time to figure it out. Not yet. With a deep breath, she stepped into the elevator of the Atlantic Crest headquarters, pressing the button for the 48th floor. When she entered the conference room, the tension hit her like a wall. 14 people sat around the massive table, 12 board members, Jonathan, and at the last minute, a seat had been added for her. A symbol of her ambiguous status in this room, the view behind them was striking, Manhattan stretching endlessly in all directions. But Naomi barely noticed. She took her seat as Catherine Langley, the board chairwoman and one of Jonathan's longtime allies, wasted no time. The timing couldn't be worse, Catherine stated, shaking her head. With the Asian expansion just weeks from launch, this kind of publicity could scare off investors and partners. One of the board members, Richard Calloway, let out a small scoff. Let's be clear, this is being blown completely out of proportion. 2 employees made a bad judgment call. Happens every day in companies across America. Naomi felt multiple pairs of eyes flick toward her, waiting, gauging. She kept her expression neutral, waiting for the right moment. It came quickly. A bad judgment call? Said Layla Thomas, one of the few women of color on the board. That bad judgment just happened to align with a pattern that people like me experience all the time. We can't just call this an isolated incident when it speaks to a larger cultural problem. Jonathan, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. I've asked Dr. Sinclair to join us today, he said, his voice even. Not as my wife, but as someone with expertise in this area. She understands both the specific incident and the broader systemic issues at play. Naomi, would you share your perspective with the board? All eyes turned to her. Naomi took a moment, gathering her thoughts. She was painfully aware of the complexity of her position here. Simultaneously an insider by marriage and an outsider by race and gender. She would have to navigate this carefully. Still, one thing was certain. She hadn't come all this way to sit at this table and say nothing. Naomi took a slow breath, steadying herself before she spoke. This isn't just about me, she said, her voice measured. It's about something much larger. People of color, especially black women, are constantly forced to prove they belong in spaces like this. The assumption is that we're here to serve, not to succeed. She let the uncomfortable silence settle over the boardroom. The difference this time isn't that it happened, she continued. It's that it happened at an airline that claims to champion diversity and inclusion. It happened to an economist with enough social capital to make the story newsworthy. And it happened in front of witnesses, including the CEO himself. Naomi scanned the room, noting the shifting expressions. Some defensive, some uneasy, others quietly reflective. The question isn't whether Atlantic Crest has a racism problem, she continued. Every major institution in this country has a racism problem. The question is, now that this issue has been made impossible to ignore, what are you actually going to do about it? Across the table, Catherine Langley leaned forward, her sharp eyes assessing. What exactly are you proposing, Dr. Sinclair? Naomi met her gaze without hesitation. A complete overhaul of the company's inclusion strategy, she said. Not just more training or symbolic hires. A fundamental examination of the corporate culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. It has to be comprehensive, transparent, and led by someone with the authority to implement actual change. At the other end of the table, Richard Calloway let out a disapproving huff. That sounds expensive, he objected, and time-consuming. Not to mention divisive among staff and customers. Layla Thomas didn't miss a beat. More expensive than the lawsuit we'll face if this happens again, she countered. More divisive than being branded as the airline that can't even treat its own CEO's wife with basic respect. The debate grew heated, the room splitting along predictable lines, those who wanted to protect the company's image versus those who saw this as an opportunity to rebuild it properly. Through it all, Jonathan remained unusually quiet. Naomi could feel his eyes on her, and when she risked a glance in his direction, she caught a flicker of something. Pride in her clarity, concern for the company, and maybe, just maybe, the lingering weight of their unresolved fight. After nearly 2 hours of deliberation, Catherine finally called for a resolution. I move that we establish a Diversity and Inclusion Action Committee with real authority and resources, reporting directly to the CEO, to address the issues Dr. Sinclair has raised. The motion passed, not unanimously, but decisively. As the meeting adjourned, board members filed out, some stopping to speak briefly with Jonathan, others offering Naomi words of support, or veiled challenges. When they were finally alone, Jonathan let his carefully maintained composure slip. "You were brilliant," he admitted, stepping beside her at the window. Even the skeptics were listening. "That's rare in that room." Naomi watched the city below, her eyes tracking the movement of tiny cars, people reduced to distant specks. "But will anything actually change?" she asked quietly. "Committees and initiatives mean nothing if the culture stays the same." Jonathan turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "That depends on who leads it." He took a breath before continuing. "I meant what I said last night, Naomi. I want you to take this on, not as my wife, as someone uniquely qualified to make a real difference." The weight of the offer settled between them. It wasn't just about the company, it was about them. Before Naomi could answer, a knock at the door interrupted them. Jonathan's assistant stepped inside, looking hesitant. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but you both need to see this." She handed Jonathan a tablet, the news article already open. Naomi leaned in. The headline made her blood run cold. Atlantic Crest Scandal Deepens. Former employees allege systemic discrimination. The article was damning, detailing complaints from 5 former employees, all people of color, describing a pattern of discrimination ranging from denied promotions to hostile work environments. The worst revelation? A former HR director claimed that complaints about racial bias had been deliberately buried to protect the company's reputation, with the knowledge and tacit approval of senior management. Jonathan's jaw tightened as he skimmed the report. "This is a coordinated attack," he muttered, his voice cold with anger. "Someone is using the incident on that flight as a weapon, and they're coming straight for us." Naomi's stomach twisted. This had just become so much bigger than either of them could have imagined. Naomi folded her arms as she watched Jonathan absorb the latest headlines. His jaw was tight, his fingers tapping restlessly against his glass. "You think this is an attack," she said carefully. "But maybe it's something else. Maybe this is the first time people feel safe enough to speak up." Jonathan's eyes snapped to hers, sharp with frustration. "You believe these allegations?" "I believe they should be investigated, not dismissed outright," she replied. "And the fact that your first reaction is to treat this as an attack rather than a potential truth, that says something, don't you think?" The tension between them thickened, no longer just about the airline but about something deeper. It was about perspective, experience. The invisible chasm that sometimes existed between them, no matter how much they loved each other. Jonathan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I need to get back to the office," he said finally. "This is escalating by the hour." Then, after a moment, softer, hesitant, "Will you be home for dinner? We still have things to discuss." Naomi nodded. "I'll be there, but Jonathan, we need to resolve our own questions too. I can't keep putting Geneva on hold." He nodded, understanding the ultimatum she hadn't quite spoken aloud. "Tonight. Then we talk about everything." When he left, Naomi lingered by the window, staring at the city below. The glass reflected her image back at her. Strong, accomplished, respected. And yet, here she was, still questioning where she truly belonged. Her phone buzzed. A text from the IMF representative. "Looking forward to our rescheduled meeting tomorrow. Decision deadline approaching. Hope you've had time to consider our offer. Time was running out." The next 24 hours wouldn't just decide the future of Atlantic Crest. They would decide the future of her career, her marriage, and everything she had spent her life building. By evening, the media storm had reached a frenzy. What had started as a single incident had now ballooned into a full-blown reckoning about the company's culture. Business networks aired heated debates about whether Atlantic Crest had a systemic problem. Investors whispered about financial risks. Social media demanded boycotts. Naomi had spent her entire life navigating these conversations. But this time, she was at the center of it. She wasn't sure how to feel. Part of her felt vindicated. Finally, people were taking these issues seriously. But another part of her, the part that still loved Jonathan despite their conflicts, despite their differences, felt the weight of what this was doing to him. By the time she arrived home, she found Jonathan already there, a rare sight. His tie loosened, jacket discarded, a half-empty glass of scotch beside his open laptop. She set her bag down and took in his exhausted expression. "That bad?" she asked. "Worse," Jonathan muttered. He didn't even look up as he spoke. Stock dropped 8% today. 2 major corporate clients called to express concerns about their partnerships, and the Asian investors. He exhaled sharply. They're suddenly reconsidering the timing of their expansion commitment. Naomi winced. The Asia expansion was his signature project, years in the making. Its success would cement Atlantic Crest as a dominant international carrier. And now, everything he had built was on unstable ground. "I'm sorry," she said sincerely. "I know how much this means to you." Jonathan took another slow sip of his drink, his gaze distant. "The irony," he said bitterly, "is that I actually thought we were doing well on diversity. We have hiring targets, mentorship programs, inclusion training." He set the glass down abruptly, finally looking at her. "Yet somehow, we still created an environment where those flight attendants felt comfortable enough to do what they did. Where did we go wrong?" It wasn't rhetorical. Naomi saw the weight in his expression, the rare moment of true humility. She considered her words carefully. "You treated diversity as a program rather than a value," she said finally. Jonathan frowned. "What do you mean?" "Programs are easy to implement," Naomi explained, "but they're just check boxes. Easy to ignore when they become inconvenient. Values, on the other hand, shape every decision, even the unconscious ones." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, silent. For the first time in days, Naomi thought, maybe he was actually listening. Jonathan sat back, turning Naomi's words over in his mind. "That's uncomfortably accurate," he admitted. Naomi offered a small knowing smile. "The good news," she said, leaning forward. "This crisis is an opportunity, if you're brave enough to embrace it." Jonathan narrowed his eyes slightly, intrigued despite himself. "What do you mean?" "Don't just defend against the allegations. Don't try to contain the damage," Naomi said, her voice gaining momentum. "Lead the conversation. Acknowledge the mistakes, own the fact that bias exists even in well-intentioned organizations, and commit, publicly, to real, measurable change." Jonathan studied her for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this." "I have," Naomi admitted, "because no matter what happens next, for me, for the airline, I care. About the people who work here. About the impact this company has." And she hesitated, searching his face. "I care about you." Jonathan exhaled, shutting his laptop with a quiet click. "I've been thinking about Geneva," he said finally, reaching for the bottle and pouring a fresh glass for each of them. Naomi took hers but didn't drink. "And?" Jonathan took a deep breath, as if steadying himself. "I've been a hypocrite," he admitted. "I've spent years talking about equity, opportunity, but I never truly applied those principles to our marriage. Your career has always been the one expected to accommodate mine." Naomi hadn't expected such an admission. A surge of hope flickered in her chest. "That means a lot to hear," she said softly, "but acknowledging the pattern is just the first step. What comes next?" Jonathan met her gaze. "I want you to take the IMF position." Naomi blinked. "You do?" "It's the opportunity of a lifetime," Jonathan said, "and you deserve it. You've supported my dreams for 12 years. It's time I supported yours." The words should have felt like relief, but something in his tone gave her pause. "But?" she prompted, sensing the weight of what wasn't being said. Jonathan exhaled, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's known you for 15 years, she teased, though her heart was hammering in her chest. "Tell me." Jonathan swirled the amber liquid in his glass before answering. The timing is difficult, he admitted. With the airline in crisis, the Asia expansion in jeopardy, I can't relocate to Geneva. Not yet. Maybe not for several months. And there it was, the reality they had both been avoiding. Naomi felt a lump form in her throat. So we'd be living apart, she said, saying the words out loud. Jonathan nodded. Temporarily, until I can stabilize things here. Then either I'll transition to working remotely or, he hesitated, or I step away from the airline altogether. Naomi tilted her head, studying him. You'd be willing to leave Atlantic Crest? After everything you've built? Jonathan let out a slow breath. Not immediately, he clarified, but eventually? Yeah, the airline has taken 15 years of my life. Maybe it's time I figure out what else I'm capable of. He reached across the kitchen island, taking her hand. Besides, he added with a small, almost mischievous smile, Switzerland has mountains, good chocolate, and a surprisingly robust business community. I might just find my next chapter there. The casual way he said it, our future, not just yours, hit Naomi hard. For the first time since receiving the offer, she allowed herself to fully believe that she wasn't just choosing herself, they were choosing each other. You make it sound so simple, she murmured, the hint of a smile playing on her lips. Jonathan let out a short laugh. Oh, it won't be. We'll be navigating time zones, weekend visits, and more than a few frustrated FaceTime calls. His voice grew serious. But we've faced harder challenges. Then a pause. Unless you think the distance would be too much, he added, his voice quieter now. Naomi took a deep breath. She owed herself an honest answer. Long-distance relationships were never easy, especially between two high-profile professionals with relentless schedules. Add in the lingering tensions from recent weeks, and the road ahead wasn't just uncertain, it was risky. And yet, the alternative, turning down the opportunity she had spent her career working toward, felt unthinkable. I think, Naomi started, looking into his eyes. I think we can make it work. Relief flashed across Jonathan's face. As long as we're both committed to finding our way back to each other, physically, emotionally, in every way that matters. Jonathan squeezed her hand. That's never been in question, he said, voice low but firm. Naomi, you are the constant in my life, the true north I navigate by. His words were unexpectedly poetic, not like him at all. And that only made them mean more. Naomi moved around the island, standing closer. She pressed her palm against his cheek, anchoring herself to him, to this moment. Then we'll make it work, she said, certainty settling into her bones. I'll accept the IMF position, you'll handle the airline crisis, and somehow, we'll build a new chapter together. Jonathan's arms wrapped around her, pulling her in. For a moment, the outside world disappeared. The media storm, the corporate turmoil, the uncertainty. It was just the two of them, still choosing each other. But their moment of peace didn't last long. Jonathan's phone buzzed insistently, then Naomi's. A synchronized intrusion, the universal signal of breaking news. They separated, reaching for their devices. Naomi's heart pounded as she read the latest headline. Exclusive, leaked documents reveal pattern of wage discrimination at Atlantic Crest's EO implicated. Her stomach dropped. She turned to Jonathan, who had gone pale. His hands tightened around his phone. Knuckles white. This is fabricated, he said through clenched teeth. I never wrote those emails. Someone is deliberately trying to destroy me. Naomi studied his face. Genuine shock. Real anger. I believe you, she said quietly, but that doesn't change the fact that someone is escalating this. Fast. Jonathan exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. I need to call the legal team, he muttered. This can't wait until morning. Naomi nodded, but the weight of what was really happening settled deep into her chest. This wasn't just bad PR anymore. This was a coordinated attack, and someone, somewhere, was pulling the strings. And if they didn't find out who was behind it soon, everything they had just fought for, their careers, their future, their marriage, could collapse before it even had a chance to begin. Naomi stood at the window, arms crossed as she gazed out at the glittering skyline. The decision had been made, she was going to Geneva, but the air still felt heavy, charged with uncertainty. Her phone vibrated in her palm. Camila, she hesitated, then answered. Have you seen the latest? Camila's voice was clipped, urgent. Yes, Naomi replied, exhaling. It's bad, Camila, really bad. A pause. And you still believe Jonathan had nothing to do with those wage disparities? Naomi stiffened. Camilla wasn't accusing him outright, but the question, carefully neutral, deliberately measured, still cut deep. You think he's lying? Naomi countered. I think, Camilla said slowly, that powerful men don't always realize how their choices affect the people below them. And sometimes, the systems they build reflect their blind spots more than their values. Naomi wanted to argue, to defend Jonathan outright, but a sliver of doubt had already wormed its way into her mind. She believed Jonathan when he said the leaked emails were fabricated. But did that mean every allegation was false? She turned from the window, pressing her fingers to her temple. This isn't just a PR disaster anymore, she murmured. It's legal. If they prove he knew about wage disparities and did nothing, he could lose everything, Camilla finished. Silence settled between them. Naomi, Camilla's voice softened. I know you love him. I know you want to believe in him. But you also need to ask yourself, are you defending Jonathan because you trust him, or because accepting his potential role in all this would force you to question everything? The words landed like a blow, shaking something loose inside Naomi. Was she too close to see the full picture? She swallowed hard. I need to go. Camilla sighed. Be careful, Naomi. The truth isn't always as simple as we want it to be. Jonathan paced in his office, barely listening as his legal team rattled off potential responses. His mind was spinning. The emails were faked, he was certain of that. But the accusations? There had always been pressure from investors, cost-cutting measures, tough decisions. Could someone in management have buried complaints in the name of financial stability? And if so, had he ignored the signs? Jonathan, said Catherine Langley, the board chairwoman, snapping him back to the moment. The board is meeting first thing tomorrow. If we don't get ahead of this, they could move to suspend you. Jonathan clenched his jaw. I won't be suspended over a lie. Then we need proof it's a lie. Silence. Then, a new voice. There's another possibility, said Elin Gwynn, his COO. She leaned forward, her expression serious. What if this isn't just a hit piece? What if someone inside Atlantic Crest is feeding this fire? Jonathan's blood ran cold. You think this is coming from inside the company? Isla nodded. Think about it. The timing, the layers to this. It's too calculated to be random. Jonathan's fingers tightened into fists. Someone inside his own company was trying to destroy him. Naomi sat alone on the couch, staring at her untouched glass of wine. Jonathan hadn't come home. She wasn't surprised, but that didn't mean it didn't sting. She glanced down at her phone, scrolling through headlines. The words blurred together. Wage discrimination, corporate sabotage, CEO under fire. Everything she had built with Jonathan, their careers, their sacrifices, their marriage, was teetering on the edge of something irreversible. And for the first time she wondered, if the company fell, if everything came crashing down, would they survive it? Naomi's fingers tightened around the phone as she processed the board chairwoman's words. A temporary leadership change. They were talking about removing Jonathan. Her stomach twisted. I have a prior commitment, she said evenly, already knowing the response she would receive. There was a pause before Catherine Langley spoke again. We'd appreciate your presence, Naomi, given your unique position. It wasn't a request. They wanted Jonathan's wife, the respected economist, the woman they had just embarrassed on one of their own planes, to be there when they discussed pushing him out. A silent chess move, a strategic piece on their board. Naomi exhaled slowly. She could say no. She could walk away, let them make their decision without her. Or she could go. And make sure they understood exactly what they were doing. I'll be there, she said at last. The line went dead. Naomi barely had time to breathe before her phone rang again. Jonathan, she answered immediately. I assume you've heard, his voice came through, low and tight. I have. There was anger in his silence. They want me there, she continued. They're moving against you, Jonathan. They think they're being clever, he muttered, bringing you in to make it look like a fair discussion. But we both know they've already made up their minds. Naomi hesitated. Then tell me the truth, Jonathan. All of it. If I walk into that room, I need to know exactly what I'm standing for. Another silence, this one heavier. The emails were fabricated, he said finally. That much is true. But the wage disparities, Jonathan sighed. Some of them might be real. The words hit like a punch. She closed her eyes. I didn't approve them, he added quickly. I never made those decisions. But could I have done more to catch them? To fix them? Maybe. The honesty, however reluctant, unnerved her. The cracks in the dam weren't just in Atlantic Crest's foundation. They were in him. You told me last night this crisis wouldn't change our plans, she said carefully. Does that still hold? Jonathan didn't answer right away. I won't ask you to choose between me and your career, he said at last. That wasn't an answer. Naomi swallowed the rising lump in her throat. I'm going to Geneva, Jonathan, she said firmly. No matter what happens today, no matter what happens to you. And she meant it. The old Naomi, the one who would have hesitated, who would have put his battles before her own, was gone. Jonathan didn't fight her on it. Then let's both do what we need to do, he said. And the line went dead. The 59th floor of Atlantic Crest's headquarters was silent when Naomi arrived. The entire board was already seated when she walked in, except for Jonathan. She took the chair that had been prepared for her, a symbolic half-step inside the room, but never fully part of it. Catherine Langley folded her hands. Thank you for coming, Naomi. Naomi's gaze swept the table. Some of them looked at her with curiosity, others with calculated neutrality. She didn't bother with pleasantries. You're here to decide whether to remove Jonathan as CEO, she stated plainly. A few members shifted uncomfortably. We're considering temporary leadership adjustments, Catherine corrected. Naomi smirked. We're not here to discuss semantics, are we? A murmur of approval from Elin Yin, the COO. Catherine pressed on. This company is in crisis, Dr. Porter. The stock has fallen, investors are wavering, and now a class action lawsuit, all of which were escalated by someone inside the company, Naomi interrupted. Are we addressing that? Or are we just looking for the easiest person to blame? Tension tightened the air. Some of them, like James Tully, the head of legal, didn't care about fairness. They wanted Jonathan out because it was easier than facing the rot beneath them. Others, like Isla, were still listening. I won't defend every decision Jonathan has made, Naomi continued measured. But if you're removing him, you should be honest about why. Catherine's lips pursed. And why do you think that is? Naomi leaned forward. Because the problems at Atlantic Crest didn't start with him, and they won't end with him either. That was the real issue, wasn't it? Jonathan wasn't the cause. He was the symptom. The board didn't want real reform. They wanted a sacrificial lamb. Before anyone could respond, the doors opened. Jonathan strode in, calm, collected, ready for war. And Naomi realized in that moment that whatever happened next, neither of them would leave this room unchanged. Naomi had spent her career anticipating difficult questions. She had prepared for this. Still, the weight of Jean-Pierre Dupont's gaze made it clear. This was not just a formality. This was the final hurdle. The IMF operates in a complex political environment, he had said. Our initiatives often face scrutiny from various stakeholders. Given the current situation with Atlantic Crest, I must ask, are there any other potential controversies in your personal or professional life that might create complications? The unspoken implication hung in the air. The IMF could weather a scandal, but it wouldn't invite one in. Naomi folded her hands, keeping her posture poised. My connection to Atlantic Crest is personal, not professional, she said steadily. I am not involved in its leadership, nor do I have any influence over its operations. My work has always stood on its own merits. Jean-Pierre nodded, as if he had expected this response. Of course, he said smoothly. But your last name is in the headlines. Whether fair or not, public perception matters. The IMF must ensure that our initiatives remain free from distractions that could undermine their credibility. Distractions. Naomi forced herself not to react. The offer was still hers, but it was conditional. She could almost hear what Jean-Pierre wasn't saying. If this crisis at Atlantic Crest worsens, if your husband is pushed out in disgrace, if more allegations surface, will you be collateral damage? She met his gaze. I understand the concern, she said evenly. But I want to be clear. Nothing happening at Atlantic Crest will affect my ability to perform this role. My record speaks for itself. Jean-Pierre studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he smiled. That's precisely what I hoped to hear, he said, closing the folder before him. A surge of relief pulsed through Naomi's veins. It was done. She had secured her future. Then I believe we are aligned, Jean-Pierre continued, rising from his seat. Our legal team will prepare your contract. We'll expect you in Geneva in 6 weeks. Naomi stood as well, shaking his hand firmly. I look forward to it. By the time Naomi stepped out onto the bustling streets of Lower Manhattan, her phone had erupted with messages. She ignored them. She needed a moment to breathe, to fully grasp what had just happened. She was leaving. 6 weeks from now, she would be in Geneva. A new country. A new career. A new chapter that was entirely her own. For the first time in years, she wasn't making a decision based on Jonathan's trajectory. This was hers. Yet even as the thrill of accomplishment settled in her chest, reality pushed back. Jonathan was still fighting to hold on to his company. The board was moving against him. And as much as Naomi had just drawn a firm boundary, she couldn't pretend this storm wasn't still raging around her. With a steadying breath, she unlocked her phone. One message stood out. From Jonathan, I need you at the office. Now. Her heart clenched. There was no context, no explanation, but she knew. Something had escalated. And just like that, her world pulled her back in. Naomi hailed a cab, sliding inside and giving the driver the address of Atlantic Crest headquarters. As the city blurred past, she braced herself. The battle for Jonathan's company was about to reach its breaking point. And whether she wanted to or not, she was about to be right in the middle of it. Naomi watched the headlines unfold on her screen, each update more surreal than the last. Breaking. Leaked emails reveal fabricated allegations against Atlantic Crest CEO Jonathan Ellison. Corporate sabotage? Evidence suggests internal plot against CEO amidst discrimination scandal. Jonathan Ellison to address employees in emergency live stream. Naomi's stomach twisted. This was bigger than a PR crisis. This was a full-scale coup, and Jonathan was about to fight back. She leaned forward in her taxi seat. Can you hurry, please? She asked the driver. The cab weaved through Manhattan's midday traffic, each red light stretching the minutes impossibly long. Her phone buzzed again. Zoe. I know you're heading to the meeting, but just remember, Jonathan is a survivor. If he's making a major announcement, it's not just about saving the company, he's playing the long game. Naomi sighed, rubbing her temples. Zoe wasn't wrong. Jonathan had built Atlantic Crest from the ground up. He wouldn't go down without a calculated move. But what exactly was his next play? And more importantly, where did that leave them? When Naomi arrived at Atlantic Crest's headquarters, the tension was palpable. Security was tight. Employees whispered in hushed tones. Executives in crisp suits moved with urgency, their expressions strained. Inside the massive auditorium, rows of seats were filled with corporate employees, mid-level managers, and senior executives. The air buzzed with anticipation. On the massive stage, Jonathan stood at a sleek podium, his expression unreadable. A large screen behind him showed a live banner, broadcasting to every Atlantic Crest office worldwide. Naomi slipped into a seat near the back, her breath shallow. This wasn't just a company announcement. This was a battle for control. Jonathan cleared his throat. Then he began. In the past week, my company, our company, has been under relentless scrutiny. Jonathan's voice was measured, controlled. It started with a single incident, an unacceptable failure in our customer service standards, but from there it became something else entirely. His blue-gray eyes swept the room. Accusations were made, some valid, some deliberately falsified, and now we know there was a coordinated effort to undermine this company from within. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Let me be clear, Jonathan continued. I take full responsibility for the culture of this company. We have work to do, and we will do that work. But I will not allow Atlantic Crest to be dismantled by individuals seeking personal gain. His voice hardened. As of today, our internal investigation has identified those responsible for the fabricated allegations. Their employment is being terminated immediately. Gasps. Shocked whispers. Naomi's eyes narrowed. This was carefully orchestrated. Jonathan had waited, watched, gathered evidence, and now, in front of the entire company, he was seizing back control. Furthermore, he continued, effective immediately, Atlantic Crest will undergo a complete overhaul of our corporate policies. This will not be a PR stunt. We will take real, measurable action. And to lead that charge, I am appointing Dr. Naomi Laurent as our new Chief Equity and Culture Officer. Naomi's entire body froze. Wait, what? Gasps filled the room. Heads turned toward her. The cameras zoomed in. On screen the words flashed. Dr. Naomi Laurent, Chief Equity and Culture Officer. Jonathan's eyes found hers across the sea of people. He had blindsided her. Completely. 100 thoughts raced through Naomi's mind. She had just accepted Geneva. She was leaving. And yet, Jonathan had just offered her a position that didn't exist until this moment. A move designed to silence internal critics. Look, we're making real change. Strengthen his control. Who better to fix things than the CEO's wife? Force Naomi's hand. How could she leave now? The room waited. Jonathan waited. Naomi's heart pounded. She had seconds to react before the entire world saw her hesitation. And in that moment, she realized something. This wasn't a gesture of love. This was a power play. A way to keep her tethered to his world, and she refused to be trapped. Naomi stood. Hundreds of eyes followed her as she walked toward the stage. Jonathan's expression softened in relief, until she took the mic. She turned toward the cameras, toward the employees, toward everyone watching. Then with a steady voice she said, "I appreciate the confidence you have in me, Jonathan. But I decline the position." The auditorium fell silent. Jonathan's face barely changed, but Naomi saw it, a flicker of shock, then something deeper. "He really thought I would say yes." She turned to the audience, her voice unwavering. "I have always believed in building systems of equity. But change cannot be performative, it must be structural. The work ahead for Atlantic Crest is critical, but it is not mine to lead." She stepped back from the podium. Jonathan's hands tightened on the edges. She had just rejected him. Not just the job, not just his plan, but his ability to dictate the terms of her future. Naomi turned on her heel and walked away, ignoring the murmurs, the stunned expressions, the flashing camera lights. Jonathan would have to face the rest of this meeting alone. For the first time in their marriage, she had chosen herself, and it felt like freedom. By the time Naomi stepped outside, her hands were shaking. She had just made a public declaration. There was no going back now. Her phone buzzed. "Zoe, that was iconic. Call me." She exhaled, allowing herself the smallest, tiniest smile. Naomi Laurent was no longer the CEO's wife. She was the woman who had just walked away, on her own terms. And in 6 weeks, she would be on a one-way flight to Geneva, leaving everything behind, including Jonathan. Naomi Laurent stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the sprawling Manhattan skyline outside the conference room window. Jonathan's request hung in the air like an impossible equation, one that asked her to divide herself between two worlds. She had just accepted Geneva. She was leaving. And now, he was asking her to stay for 6 weeks. Just long enough to stabilize the company, he had said. Just long enough to find a permanent CEO. Jonathan stood behind her, waiting, watching, hoping, and Naomi felt torn apart. "If, and that's a big if, I were to consider this," she said, forcing herself to speak slowly, deliberately, "I would need complete autonomy. No interference from you. No pressure from the board." "Agreed," Jonathan said immediately. "And it would be explicitly temporary." "Absolutely." She turned, finally meeting his gaze. "Jonathan, you do realize what you're asking me, don't you?" Her voice was measured, but he could hear the frustration underneath. "I do," he admitted. "And if there were anyone else, Naomi, I wouldn't ask." Her chest tightened. "You always do this," she thought. He never asked for small sacrifices. It was always something monumental. Always something that required her to bend, to compromise, to rearrange herself around his world. And yet, she understood the stakes, the employees rallying behind him, the board maneuvering to push him out, the company crumbling under the weight of scandal. It was a mess, a complete mess, and Jonathan needed her for 6 weeks. Just long enough to right the ship before she boarded a plane to Switzerland. She closed her eyes for half a second, then exhaled. "Fine," she said. Jonathan's shoulders relaxed. "But listen to me," Naomi continued, stepping forward. "If I take this on, I do it my way. No board politics, no watered-down initiatives, and absolutely no expectation that I stay longer than 6 weeks." Jonathan nodded. "And one more thing," she added, her voice sharp. "I want it in writing." Hours later, Naomi sat at the head of the boardroom table. Her name was being added to an emergency leadership announcement as interim CEO of Atlantic Crest Airlines. The position felt both enormous and temporary, like a crown that had been placed on her head, knowing she would remove it in a matter of weeks. She signed the documents. Jonathan watched her carefully. Some part of him, she knew, was hoping she might change her mind. That once she settled into the role, once she saw what they could build together, she might decide Geneva wasn't so necessary after all. But Naomi already knew. This wasn't her future. It was her last favor, and in 6 weeks, she would be gone. Naomi Laurent had never imagined herself sitting in the CEO's chair at Atlantic Crest Airlines, and certainly not like this. She adjusted her posture, letting the weight of the moment settle over her as she scrolled through personnel files, searching for patterns, searching for weaknesses, searching for the enemy within. Her phone vibrated on the desk. Another message from Zoe. So you finally get your dream job in Geneva. And Jonathan convinces you to save his company first. Classic Jonathan. Naomi sighed. She had already explained to Zoe and to herself that this wasn't about Jonathan. It was about principles. It was about fixing what was broken, about ensuring that the employees who had rallied behind Jonathan weren't left vulnerable to the machinations of the board. Still, don't let 6 weeks turn into 6 months, Naomi. The IMF won't wait forever. Zoe wasn't wrong. Naomi would not let this become a trap. 6 weeks, that was it. Her gaze flickered to the personnel files. Someone inside this company had tried to destroy Jonathan. Someone powerful enough to manipulate an entire crisis from the shadows. She intended to find out who, and she wouldn't leave until she did. The office door swung open without a knock. Naomi's head snapped up, irritation flashing across her face. A tall, immaculately dressed woman strode in, Melanie Parker, head of operations. If Jonathan's corporate structure had a gatekeeper, Melanie was it. You're reviewing senior personnel files? Melanie observed, glancing at Naomi's screen without invitation. Looking for something specific? Naomi didn't blink, just getting a sense of the landscape. Melanie crossed her arms. The landscape is complicated, she said smoothly. I'm aware, Naomi replied evenly. They locked eyes. A silent assessment passed between them, a test of will. Melanie was one of the few women in senior leadership. Smart, ruthless, untouchable. And yet, there was something off about her presence here. Melanie was the kind of person who never moved without purpose. So why was she here now? You must be incredibly busy, Naomi said, carefully neutral. I wouldn't want to take up your time unless there's something specific you need. Melanie tilted her head as if weighing how much to say. Then a slow smile. I just wanted to see for myself, she said lightly. See what? If you're really in charge, or just keeping the seat warm until Jonathan takes it back. A challenge. Naomi didn't flinch. She leaned back in her chair, deliberately relaxed. Melanie, she said, if you think I'm just here to warm a seat, then you haven't been paying attention. Melanie held her gaze for a moment longer. Then, to Naomi's mild surprise, she gave a small nod of approval. Good, she said. We'll see how long that lasts. With that, she turned and walked out, as swiftly as she had entered. Naomi exhaled, her mind already dissecting the encounter. Melanie Parker was up to something. She just had to figure out what. Naomi Laurent stared at the access logs on the tablet, her pulse quickening. Someone had been logging into Jonathan's email, someone inside the company, and not just once, multiple times. During meetings she had attended with him, during the dinner with Zoe and Daniel, even mid-flight during the incident with the flight attendants. Someone had been using Jonathan's credentials to orchestrate this entire crisis. And there were only 3 people who had access to his account. Jonathan himself, his executive assistant, Rebecca, and James Winters. Melanie's voice was tight. He was the one who set up Jonathan's security protocols last year. If anyone could manipulate access without raising alarms, it's him. Naomi exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers against her temples. James Winters had been Jonathan's right-hand man for over a decade. A loyal lieutenant until recently. Jonathan had passed him over for a promotion 3 times. The most recent? The Asian Expansion Project. A role James had desperately wanted. Naomi didn't believe in coincidences. Have you spoken to him? She asked. Melanie shook her head. I came straight to you. If he's behind this, confronting him too soon could give him time to erase any digital footprints. Naomi nodded. Then we don't confront him. Not yet. First, we bring in cybersecurity and legal. Quietly. No one outside this room knows until we have concrete evidence. Melanie's lips pressed into a thin line. Understood. As she left to assemble the team, Naomi's phone rang. Jonathan, calling from Singapore. She hesitated, then answered. How are things on your end? Jonathan's voice was distant, laced with exhaustion. Naomi's grip on the phone tightened. Do I tell him? She made a choice. We're making progress, she said carefully. Not a lie. I've ordered a full audit of our diversity data. Not just the official reports, but the real numbers, department by department, level by level. Jonathan was silent for a moment. Finding anything concerning? Naomi exhaled. Nothing surprising. The same patterns we see everywhere. Women and minorities disappearing from leadership ranks. Subtle disparities in promotions and salaries, explainable individually but undeniable as a pattern. A corporate culture problem too deep for any one initiative to fix. I'm also reviewing senior leadership, she added. Some changes may be necessary. Another pause. Then Jonathan said the one thing she needed to hear. You have full authority to do whatever you think is right. That had been their deal. Yes, it was, Naomi confirmed. And still she didn't tell him about James. Not yet. Things in Singapore? Naomi asked, steering the conversation away. Jonathan sighed, but there was a flicker of optimism in his tone. Better than expected. Your appointment as interim CEO actually helped. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Really? The investors see it as a bold move. It signals that we're taking the diversity issue seriously instead of just spinning PR. And your credentials carry weight here. Well, at least something good came out of this mess, Naomi said, a trace of dry amusement in her voice. A pause, then softer. Naomi? She knew what was coming. I know this isn't easy, Jonathan said. You didn't ask for any of this. No, she hadn't. And yet, here she was, leading a company she never wanted to run, investigating a betrayal she never saw coming, preparing for a future that no longer felt certain. Just promise me something, Jonathan said quietly. Naomi closed her eyes. What? When this is over, when your 6 weeks are up, you still get on that plane to Geneva. She opened her eyes, staring out at the New York skyline. A city she loved, a city she was ready to leave. She thought of the IMF, of Geneva, of the life she had spent years building toward. 6 weeks. That was all she had promised, and she wouldn't break that promise. Naomi's voice was steady when she replied, I will. She just hoped she believed it. Naomi Laurent locked eyes with James Winters. Across the desk he exuded his usual calm confidence, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the barely perceptible stiffness in his posture. He knows. She slid the cybersecurity report toward him. I think you already know what I'm accusing you of, James. James glanced down at the document. The evidence was clear. Unauthorized access to Jonathan's email. Time-stamped logins that aligned with fabricated evidence leaks. Connection to Vanessa Mills, the flight attendant involved in the original scandal. He took his time scanning the report, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the desk. Then he looked up. Expression unreadable. Voice measured. What exactly do you want me to say? Naomi leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. The truth. A dry chuckle. The truth. That's a matter of perspective. Her eyes narrowed. You accessed Jonathan's account, James. Her voice was quiet, controlled. You created fake emails. You fed information to the press. And based on what I've recently learned, you weren't acting alone. James tilted his head slightly. And what exactly do you plan to do with this theory? No denial, which meant he knew the evidence against him was too strong. Naomi took a breath. Stay calm, stay strategic. That depends, she said. If you cooperate, if you tell me who else is involved, then maybe there's a way forward that doesn't end with your career in flames. A slow, measured smile crept onto James' face. There it is, he murmured. The offer of mercy. Naomi didn't blink. Is it strategic to offer a lifeline to someone who just set fire to their own future? His smile didn't waver, but his fingers stilled. For the first time since he entered the room, James Winters looked uncertain. James exhaled, his confidence flickering. You really want to know why, Naomi? She said nothing, waiting. He leaned back in his chair. 15 years, I built this company with Jonathan. 15 years I was loyal. I helped him take transatlantic from a mid-tier airline to a global leader. A pause. And when it was time for a promotion? When it was time for recognition? His eyes darkened. I was overlooked. Again and again. Naomi's stomach tightened. This wasn't just about professional jealousy, she said, studying him. You wanted to destroy him. James' smile vanished. You still don't get it. His voice turned sharper, more bitter. Jonathan isn't the only problem. This whole company is built on hypocrisy. Naomi frowned. Meaning? James let out a low laugh. Oh, come on, you've seen the reports, you've seen the diversity numbers. Jonathan parades you out as the progressive choice to fix everything, but this company's culture is rotten. A beat? And you know it. Naomi's pulse sped up. He was right about one thing, the problems at Transatlantic weren't just about Jonathan, but that didn't justify what James had done. You had a chance to push for real change, Naomi said. Instead, you chose sabotage. James scoffed. Change? Here, please. I did what I had to do. I exposed the truth. Or at least a version of it. Naomi's jaw clenched. A version of it. That was the problem. Yes, there were real issues at Transatlantic, real biases, real systemic problems. But James hadn't exposed them. He had fabricated evidence, manufactured a scandal, lied, and in doing so, he had buried the truth under conspiracy. Now, any legitimate concerns from employees would be dismissed as part of a smear campaign. And that was the real betrayal. Naomi stood. We're done here. James raised an eyebrow. Just like that? She nodded toward the door. Our legal team will be in touch. You should probably clear out your office. James let out a slow breath. And if I refuse? Naomi tilted her head. Then we call law enforcement. A flicker of something dangerous passed through his expression. Then, after a beat, he laughed. You're good, Naomi, he said, standing. Better than I gave you credit for. He started toward the door, but just before leaving, he turned back. One last thing, he said. You really think Jonathan didn't know about the wage disparities? Naomi froze. James smirked. You think he's innocent, he murmured. But what if he just looked the other way? A chill ran down Naomi's spine. She said nothing as James left, but the seed of doubt had been planted. And it was growing. As soon as James was gone, Naomi collapsed into her chair, her hands clenched into fists. She had won. She had uncovered the truth. She had exposed the saboteur. But James's final words echoed in her mind. You think Jonathan didn't know? She pulled up the internal reports again. The pay disparities, the promotion statistics, the diversity audits. Jonathan had seen these numbers. He had known, and he hadn't done anything. Naomi felt sick, because James Winters had been wrong about many things. But on this, he might have been right. James exhaled slowly. I'll resign. Amara watched him, searching for any sign of deception. There was none. Not because he was remorseful. Not because he regretted his actions, but because he had already accepted his fate. I've achieved what I set out to do, James added, his voice measured. Amara's stomach tightened. And what exactly was that? A slow, deliberate smile spread across his face. I proved a point. Her jaw clenched. You tried to destroy an entire company. I didn't destroy it. His gaze sharpened. I exposed it. Silence stretched between them. Amara had spent weeks untangling the damage James had done. The fake allegations, the media storm, the stock collapse, the employees caught in the crossfire. And yet, he wasn't entirely wrong. The real issues at Transatlantic had existed long before James Winters exploited them. Before her own experience of racial profiling on Flight 267, she had seen the hiring data, the promotion disparities, the patterns of exclusion that no one had wanted to acknowledge. James hadn't invented those problems, he had simply weaponized them. That truth sat heavily on her shoulders. She could destroy James Winters, expose everything, make an example of him. But would that change anything? Or would it simply allow the company to bury its deeper failures along with him? Amara crossed her arms. You'll resign immediately. No severance, no references. James nodded. Fine. And, she added, you'll sign a legally binding non-disclosure agreement. His smirk returned. So the truth stays buried? No, Amara corrected. The lies stay buried. I won't let you undermine the real issues any further. James studied her. Then he laughed. Amazing, he muttered. You really believe you can fix this company, don't you? Amara's gaze didn't waver. I believe in doing the work, she said. Something you weren't willing to do. James's smirk faded. For the first time, Amara saw something resembling regret flicker across his expression. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He extended his hand. Deal. She ignored it. Your resignation letter is due by the end of the hour. Security will escort you out. James lowered his hand. Good luck, Dr. Laurent. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the office. Amara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had won. But the real fight was just beginning. By midday, James Winters' resignation had been announced to the company. The official statement framed it as a mutual decision. No mention of corporate sabotage, no mention of fabricated evidence. But inside the walls of Transatlantic, the whispers had already started, and Amara knew that fixing the company's culture would take far more than removing one bad actor. That evening, she sat in her office, staring at the draft of her own resignation letter. 3 weeks left. Then Geneva. Her future. Her own path. She was about to shut down her laptop when her phone buzzed. Jonathan. She hesitated before answering. "Hey," she said softly. "I just saw the announcement," he said. "James is gone?" "Yes." Silence. Then quietly, "Thank you." Amara closed her eyes. She wished she could take comfort in that gratitude. But James's final words still echoed in her mind. "You really think Jonathan didn't know?" She had pushed that thought away before. Now she wasn't sure she could anymore. Amara traced the cool brass of the compass with her fingertips. Alexander's note was short, but it said everything. "Wherever you go, my heart follows." She swallowed hard, caught between the warmth of his words and the weight of all they had been through in the past 6 weeks. The crises, the betrayals, the late-night strategy sessions, the arguments, the victories, and now the goodbye. She exhaled slowly. Tomorrow, she would board her flight to Geneva. Tomorrow, the life she had chosen for herself would truly begin. When she entered the conference room, conversations hushed. Executives, board members, senior staff, people who had, just weeks ago, questioned her authority, now stood to applaud. Melanie Parker, now COO, gave her a knowing nod. Rebecca offered a small smile. Even Catherine Reynolds, the formidable board chairwoman, lifted her glass in Amara's direction. Alexander stood near the front of the room, his gaze finding hers immediately. There was something different in his expression. Pride, admiration, and something else, something uncertain. When the applause faded, Alexander stepped forward. 6 weeks ago, he began, this company faced a crisis that threatened to unravel everything we had built. Our reputation, our leadership, even our very foundation. He glanced at Amara, his voice steady. Then my wife, Dr. Amara Laurent, stepped into this office and reminded us all what leadership actually looks like. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. She didn't just manage a crisis, Alexander continued. She forced us to confront our blind spots. She pushed for change where change was overdue. And she didn't let any of us, especially me, off the hook. Soft laughter broke the tension. But as much as I wish I could convince her to stay, he added, we all know Amara is meant for greater things. Geneva is lucky to have her. He turned to her. Amara, on behalf of Transatlantic Airlines, thank you. Another round of applause. This time Amara felt the emotion behind it. She had changed something here. Maybe not everything, maybe not enough, but something, and that mattered. After the reception, Alexander found her in the CEO's office, now emptied of her belongings. This place suits you, he said, glancing around. She smiled. I was just a visitor. Alexander exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I meant what I said earlier. You were brilliant, Amara. You didn't just hold things together, you made them better. Thank you. A beat of silence. Then, the real conversation. I meant what I said too, Amara said, folding her arms. Tomorrow, I get on that plane. I know, Alexander said quietly. You're really okay with that? No, he admitted, but I respect it. She studied him, searching for any sign of resentment. She found none. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another envelope. This is the address of an apartment I found in Geneva, he said. It's not official yet, but if you think it's a good fit, let me know. Amara's heart stuttered. He wasn't asking her to stay. He was telling her he would follow. Tears pricked the back of her eyes. I don't know how long it'll take to wrap things up here. Alexander continued. But I meant what I said, Amara. This time, I'm the one making the move for you. She swallowed the lump in her throat. You really think you can leave Transatlantic? Alexander smiled, a small, tired, but certain smile. I think it's time I build something new, he said, with you. She took a deep breath, then nodded. Then I guess I'll see you in Geneva. His relief was palpable. They stood there for a moment, neither one quite ready to say goodbye. Then, finally, Amara stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. No more ultimatums, no more debates, just them. Their next chapter was waiting, and this time they would write it together. The next morning, as Amara's plane climbed into the sky, she pulled out Alexander's parting gift, the compass. She turned it over in her hands, watching the needle steady itself. True north. A small smile tugged at her lips. For the first time in a long time, Amara Laurent knew exactly where she was going, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't going alone. The end.